In the village of Umuchieze, there was a man named Obinna who did something strange at funerals. While others cried and mourned, Obinna laughed loudly. His laughter wasn't quiet or nervous, it was full, rich, and unrestrained, as if he had just heard the funniest joke in the world. The villagers did not understand it. How could someone laugh at such a sad time? Children ran away from him, whispering that he was cursed. Adults muttered behind his back, calling him a madman. Some said he had offended the gods. Others believed he had lost his mind. But Obinna never explained himself. He simply smiled and walked away, leaving confusion in his wake. One morning the village awoke to tragic news. Elder Namdi, the wisest and most respected man in Umuchieze, had passed away. Namdi was a man of peace and wisdom, a father to the people. When children were hungry he fed them. When neighbors quarreled he settled disputes. His death cast a shadow over the village and tears flowed freely. Preparations for his funeral began immediately. The villagers wanted to honor him with the most dignified burial. But there was one fear that gripped their hearts. Would Obinna come? And if he did, would he laugh? On the day of the funeral, the people gathered in the village square under a large canopy. The air was heavy with sorrow, the silence broken only by quiet sobs. Namdi's family sat at the front, weeping. The priest began to speak, recalling the great life of the elder. Then, just as the priest lifted his hands in prayer, Obinna arrived. He stood at the back of the gathering wearing his usual old wrapper and dusty sandals. All eyes turned to him. The villagers held their breath. Then it happened. Obinna laughed. It was not a chuckle. It was not nervous. It was loud, thunderous, echoing through the gathering. Gasps filled the air. People turned to stare at him in horror. Tufiakwa. What kind of madness is this? An old woman exclaimed. Namdi's son, Chibuzo, jumped to his feet, his eyes burning with fury. How dare you laugh at my father's funeral? He shouted, storming toward Obinna. The villagers murmured angrily, some calling for him to be thrown out. But Obinna did not stop laughing. He clutched his stomach, shaking his head as though he had just heard the funniest joke. Chibuzo's fists tightened. What is wrong with you? Why do you laugh when we are mourning? The crowd moved closer, eager for an explanation. But Obinna only wiped the tears of laughter from his eyes and smiled. I am not mocking your father, he said softly. I laugh because I see what you cannot. The crowd gasped. What do you mean? Chibuzo demanded. Obinna shook his head. You would not understand. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving the village in stunned silence. After the funeral, the villagers could not stop talking about what had happened. Why would Obinna say such strange things? A woman asked. Maybe he knows something we don't, another whispered. Some believed Obinna had a secret. Others insisted he was mad. But Chibuzo couldn't let it go. He felt humiliated and angry. He disrespected my father, Chibuzo said to himself. I will find out what he meant no matter what. Determined, he began asking questions about Obinna, hoping to uncover the truth behind his strange laughter. But before Chibuzo could learn much, tragedy struck again. A young woman named Adana, known for her kindness and beauty, died suddenly. The villagers were heartbroken. Adana's mother cried loudly, saying her daughter's death did not feel like an accident. Rumors of foul play spread like wildfire. Her funeral was planned for the next day, and the villagers whispered nervously. Will Obinna come? They asked. And if he does, will he laugh again? The next morning, under cloudy skies, the village gathered for Adana's funeral. Her family sat in the front row, their wails piercing the air. The priest began his prayers. Then, just as before, Obinna arrived. This time, the villagers watched him closely, their bodies tense. For a moment, it seemed like he would stay quiet. But then, as the priest continued, Obinna started laughing again. His laughter was louder than before. Stronger. More unsettling. Adana's mother screamed. Why are you laughing at my daughter's death? The villagers turned toward Obinna, their fury growing. But he did not stop. This time, he stopped laughing and looked at Adana's mother with a serious face. I do not laugh at your daughter, he said. I laugh because the truth is near. A wave of fear swept through the crowd. What truth? Someone shouted. Stop speaking in riddles, another cried. But Obinna did not answer. He turned and walked away just as he had done before. Chibuzo, still burning with anger, had seen enough. He knows something, Chibuzo thought. And I will make him tell me. That evening, Chibuzo followed Obinna to his small hut at the edge of the village. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the trees. Obinna sat outside staring at the sky. Tell me what you meant, Chibuzo demanded. What truth are you talking about? Obinna sighed and turned to face him. The dead do not rest until their stories are told, he said. Chibuzo's breath hitched. What stories? Obinna's face grew serious. Your father and Adana were killed, Chibuzo. And the truth will not stay hidden. Chibuzo froze, staring at Obinna in disbelief. What are you saying? My father was poisoned? Adana was killed? He asked, his voice shaking. Obinna nodded solemnly. The dead speak, Chibuzo. I hear their cries. Elder Namdi and Adana's spirits are restless, and they demand justice. Chibuzo shook his head. This is madness. You expect me to believe you can hear the dead? Obinna sighed. You don't have to believe me. But the truth will reveal itself. Listen carefully and you will find out too. Chibuzo returned to the village, his heart heavy. He told no one about his conversation with Obinna, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. Meanwhile, the villagers kept talking. Why does he laugh and speak in riddles? They asked. Some said he was cursed by the gods, while others believed he had powers to see beyond the living. If he knows the truth, he must share it, an elder said. The pressure on Obinna grew, but he remained calm and silent. Unable to ignore Obinna's words, Chibuzo made a decision. He would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Chibuzo couldn't shake the words Obinna had spoken. The dead do not rest until their stories are told. His father and Adana had been murdered, and somewhere in Umuchieze their killer still walked free. That night he lay awake, staring at the thatched roof of his hut. His mind raced with questions. Who would want to harm his father? Why would anyone kill Adana? Was there a connection between the two deaths? The next morning he set out to find answers. His first stop was Mama Yugo, the village herbalist who had been treating Elder Namdi before his passing. When he arrived at her hut, she was outside, sorting through freshly gathered herbs. She looked up and smiled sadly. Ah, Chibuzo, my son. You must still be grieving? Chibuzo sat beside her. Mama Yugo, I need to know something. Before my father passed, did he ever mention feeling sick? Did he complain about his food tasting strange? Mama Yugo sighed deeply, her eyes dark with thought. Your father came to me weeks before he died, complaining of stomach pains. He said his food had tasted bitter. I gave him herbs to ease his pain, but it was already too late. Chibuzo's heart pounded. It was just as Obinna had said. Do you think he was poisoned? Chibuzo asked. Mama Yugo hesitated before nodding. I cannot say for sure, but I have seen poison before. The way your father weakened day by day, it was not a natural illness. Chibuzo clenched his fists. And what about Adana? She died suddenly. Could it be the same poison? Mama Yugo's lips pressed into a thin line. Adana was healthy. There was no reason for her to die so young. Something is wrong in this village, my son. A chill ran down Chibuzo's spine. Someone had poisoned his father. Someone had silenced Adana. But why? Determined to find the truth, he went to the village elders. Elder Okafor, a longtime friend of his father, agreed to speak with him. Elder, Chibuzo began, did my father have any enemies? Okafor's expression darkened. Your father was a great man, but even great men have rivals. There was tension between him and your uncle Ikena? Chibuzo's breath hitched. Uncle Ikena? But he was my father's younger brother. They were close. Elder Okafor sighed. Not as close as you think. There was a dispute over land. Your father wanted to divide the family farmland, but Ikena refused. They argued many times about it. Chibuzo felt his stomach twist. Could his own uncle have killed his father over land? As he left the elder's hut, he spotted Obinna, sitting beneath a mango tree, laughing softly to himself. Chibuzo approached him. You knew, didn't you? He asked. You knew my father was murdered? Obinna nodded. I told you, Chibuzo. The dead do not lie. Chibuzo sat beside him, rubbing his hands over his face. My uncle, he had a reason to kill my father. But what about Adana? How is she connected to this? Obinna's expression grew somber. Adana overheard something. Something dangerous. Chibuzo's breath caught. She knew who poisoned my father? Obinna nodded. And that is why she was silenced. A wave of grief and anger washed over Chibuzo. His father had been murdered. Adana had been killed because she knew the truth. And the man responsible was someone from his own bloodline. Ikena must have had help, Chibuzo said, his voice shaking. Someone must have prepared the poison. Obinna tilted his head. Ask the ones who served your father's meals. Chibuzo stood, his heart pounding. He knew exactly where to go next. The next morning he made his way to his family compound and found Ngozi, the the housemaid who had worked for their household for years. She was sweeping the yard when he approached. "Ngozi," Chibuzo said carefully, "I need to ask you about my father's meals before he died." Ngozi stiffened, gripping the broom tightly. "I don't know anything, Chibuzo," she said quickly. Chibuzo stepped closer. "I think you do." She looked around nervously, then whispered, "Please, I don't want trouble." Chibuzo's patience wore thin. "Ngozi, my father and Adana are dead. If you know something, tell me." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't want to do it, Chibuzo. Your uncle threatened me. He said if I didn't put the powder in the food, he would harm my family." Chibuzo felt his blood boil. "So, you did poison my father?" Ngozi sobbed. "I only mixed it in the stew just as Ikena told me. I swear I didn't know it would kill him. And Adana, she overheard me speaking with your uncle. That's why he killed her." Chibuzo staggered back. The truth was now clear. Ikena had poisoned Elder Namdi. And when Adana found out, he had her killed to keep her silent. Trembling with rage, Chibuzo turned away. It was time to confront his uncle. That night, Chibuzo gathered the village elders and demanded a trial. When Ikena was summoned, he arrived wearing a confident smirk as if he had nothing to fear. "What is the meaning of this?" Ikena asked. Chibuzo stepped forward, his voice steady. "We know what you did, uncle. You poisoned my father over land. And you killed Adana to keep her quiet." A hush fell over the village. All eyes turned to Ikena. Ikena's smirk faltered. "This is nonsense," he scoffed. "Where is your proof?" Chibuzo turned to Ngozi. Her hands trembled, but she lifted her chin and spoke. "Ikena gave me the poison," she confessed. "He forced me to mix it in the elders' food." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The elders' faces darkened. Chibuzo pointed at Ikena. "You betrayed your own blood. You killed my father for land." For the first time, Ikena looked afraid. It wasn't meant to kill him," he stammered. "Just to weaken him so he would give up the land." The elders murmured among themselves. His guilt was clear. Elder Okafor raised his staff. "Ikena, you have committed a terrible crime against your own kin. For this, you will be banished from Umuchieze forever." Ikena fell to his knees, begging, but the elder's decision was final. The villagers dragged him away, and for the first time in weeks, justice was served. That evening, Chibuzo found Obinna sitting beneath the mango tree, smiling. Chibuzo sat beside him. "You were right," he said. "The truth always comes out." Obinna chuckled. "And now the dead can rest." Chibuzo sighed, staring at the dark sky. His father and Adana had been avenged. The village was safe again. As he stood to leave, he heard Obinna laughing softly behind him. For the first time, Chibuzo understood. Obinna never laughed at funerals out of mockery. He laughed because he always knew the truth would win in the end. The village of Umuchieze slowly returned to normal after Ikena's banishment. The land dispute was settled, and the elders divided Elder Namdi's land fairly among his family. The people whispered about the betrayal, but they also respected Chibuzo for standing up for the truth. Yet something still felt unfinished. One evening, Chibuzo sat outside his father's compound, staring at the moonlit sky. Even with Ikena gone, a strange feeling of unrest lingered in his heart. "Why do I still feel like something is missing?" he muttered to himself. A soft chuckle came from behind him. "Obinna." Chibuzo turned to see the strange man standing nearby, his arms folded as he watched the night sky. "You still don't see it, do you?" Obinna asked, shaking his head. Chibuzo frowned. "See what?" "Ikena poisoned my father and killed Adana. He was punished. What else is there?" Obinna sighed, stepping closer. "Do you really believe Ikena acted alone?" Chibuzo's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Obinna leaned in. "The poison. Ikena didn't make it. He didn't know how to prepare something so deadly. Someone else gave it to him." Chibuzo's heart pounded. "Who?" Obinna tilted his head. "That is the question you should ask yourself." Chibuzo took a deep breath. If Ikena didn't act alone, then someone else in the village had played a role in his father's death. And that person was still here. The next morning, Chibuzo went back to Mama Yugo, the herbalist who had first suspected poison in his father's death. She welcomed him with a knowing look. "I knew you would return," she said, stirring a pot of herbs over a small fire. Chibuzo sat down. "Mama Yugo, tell me the truth. Who in this village could have given Ikena the poison?" She stopped stirring. "There is only one person in this village who knows how to prepare such a deadly mix." Chibuzo's pulse quickened. "Who?" She looked him straight in the eye. "Elder Okafor." Chibuzo's breath caught. "That's impossible. He was my father's friend." Mama Yugo sighed. "Friend or not, Okafor was once a master of herbs. If anyone could make a slow, undetectable poison, it was him. Chibuzo shook his head. Okafor was the one who first mentioned Ikena's land dispute. Could he have been trying to mislead me? He needed to be sure. That night, Chibuzo made his way to Elder Okafor's compound. The old man sat outside, smoking his pipe. "Ah, Chibuzo," he said, his voice calm. "What brings you here at this hour?" Chibuzo sat down across from him, his fists clenched. "I need to ask you something, Elder." Okafor exhaled a cloud of smoke. "Go ahead." Chibuzo's voice was steady. "Did you give Ikena the poison?" For a brief moment, Okafor froze. Then he smiled. "You're smarter than I thought," Okafor said, his voice no longer warm. Chibuzo's stomach turned. He had been right. "Why?" Chibuzo demanded. "Why would you betray my father?" Okafor leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Your father was too powerful. Too respected. He stood in the way of progress. Ikena was just a pawn." Chibuzo's hands trembled. "You used my uncle?" Okafor chuckled. "And he was foolish enough to trust me?" Chibuzo felt rage boil inside him. This man had been manipulating everything from the beginning. Before he could speak, Okafor continued, "But what will you do now, boy? The elders trust me. The people respect me. If you accuse me without proof, you will be the one cast out." Chibuzo knew he was right. He needed evidence. "I was right," Chibuzo said, his voice tense. "Okafor is behind everything. But I have no proof." Obinna smirked. "Then we make him confess." Together they devised a plan. That evening, Chibuzo called for a village gathering. The people of Umuchieze gathered under the great Irako tree. Elder Okafor arrived, unaware of what was about to unfold. Chibuzo stepped forward. "Elders, people of Umuchieze, I bring news of my father's murder." The crowd murmured. Elder Okafor frowned. "Haven't we already dealt with this?" Chibuzo nodded. "Yes, Ikena was guilty. But he did not act alone." Gasps filled the air. Chibuzo turned to the crowd. "Ikena was given the poison by someone powerful. Someone we all trust." Elder Okafor's face darkened. "This is nonsense." Chibuzo took a deep breath. "Then let us settle this with an oath of truth." The crowd fell silent. The oath of truth was a sacred ritual. Anyone who swore falsely under the god's watch would be cursed. Elder Okafor's jaw tightened. "This is foolishness." Chibuzo stared at him. "Then take the oath, Elder." The village priest stepped forward, holding a calabash filled with sacred water. "If you are innocent, Elder Okafor, then swear before Amadioha, the god of justice." Sweat formed on Okafor's brow. He hesitated. The people whispered. Chibuzo pressed on. "If you are truly innocent, you have nothing to fear." Okafor's hands trembled. "This is ridiculous. I will not." Suddenly Obinna laughed. It was loud, cutting through the silence like thunder. "Do you see it now, my people?" Obinna called out. "A guilty man will never swear before the gods." The villagers gasped. Elder Okafor's face turned pale. He took a step back. Then another. Chibuzo's heart pounded. He was going to run. But before he could, the elders surrounded him. "Elder Okafor," one of them said, "you have refused the oath of truth. That alone is a sign of guilt." The village chief's voice was firm. "You will be judged." Elder Okafor fell to his knees, realizing his fate was sealed. Justice is served. That night, Elder Okafor was stripped of his title and banished from Umuchieze, just as Ikena had been. The village breathed a sigh of relief. The true mastermind had been revealed. As the people returned to their homes, Chibuzo found Obinna sitting beneath the mango tree as usual. Obinna smiled. "So, do you understand now?" Chibuzo sat beside him. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Obinna grinned. "The dead never keep secrets." Chibuzo exhaled. Finally his father's spirit could rest. He turned to Obinna. "Will you ever stop laughing?" Obinna chuckled. "Not as long as there is truth to be uncovered." Chibuzo shook his head, smiling. In the distance, the wind carried the sound of Obinna's laughter, blending into the night like a song of justice.